talking about the cross-cultural generalizability of year in school effects, basically the negative effects of acceleration and the positive effects of retention and academic self-concept. So, most of you know the big fish little pond effect. Basically, we're saying that individual achievement has a positive effect on self-concept. School average has a negative effect. The brighter I am, the better my academic self-concept is. The brighter everybody around me is, the lower my academic self-concept. However, being in a school environment with highly able students as operationalized by school average achievement is not the only way in which a student's frame of reference can be altered. For a whole variety of reasons, such as acceleration or starting school at an early age, students can find themselves in classes with older, more academically advanced students who form a possibly more demanding frame of reference than would be their same age classmates. Similarly, at the opposite end, due to starting school at a
Thank you.
You mean I'm 12 minutes done already? Due to starting school at a later age or being held back to repeat a grade, students can find themselves in classes with younger, less academic advanced students than they would if they were with same age school classmates. So the second figure looks like the big fish little pond effect, but the critical variable is relative year in school rather than school average ability. So based on the logic of the big fish little pond effect, I posited and found that the relative year in school, that is being one or more years ahead or one or more years behind same age classmates, would have a negative effect on academic self-concept. The effects of academic self-concept were negative for de facto acceleration, starting early or skipping grades, and positive for de facto retention, starting late, acceleration starting early or skipping, positive for de facto retention, starting late or repeating. Okay, now critical variable here is relative age in school, so let me give us a separate slide on that. So this is the PISA data where everybody is 15-year-olds, but in the PISA data in almost every country, there's a range of 2 or 3 or even 4 grades in school, years in school that the 15-year-olds actually are. So relative year in school is the actual year in school that the person is in compared to the average year in school for 15-year-olds in the same country. So positive values indicate that a student has been accelerated, started young, or skipped a grade. Negative values indicate that the student has been retained, started late, or repeated a grade. Okay, so here's the basic conceptual model. The critical results are the main effects of the main independent variables, particularly school average achievement in year in school, and the main dependent variable is math self-concept. Correlates are year in school that are used to test the assumption. Correlates of the year in school, they're used to test the assumptions of what these mean. So these are starting age, when the student started school. Retention is whether or not they've ever been held back, and acceleration is whether or not they've ever skipped a grade. Then I've looked at potential moderators to test if any of these variables substantially moderate the effect of school average achievement, the big fish little pond effect, or the year in school effects on math self-concept. And then I also looked at additional outcomes to look to see whether these effects on math self-concept generalize to a variety of other psychosocial variables that are also of interest. Okay, so here's the basic results. For all the models, the effect of individual student achievement is mostly linear and positive. So the brighter I am, the higher my academic self-concept. The critical one, the particular one that's important, is the negative effect of year in school. And then there's also the negative big fish little pond effect. So the negative effects of year in school are not as large as the negative effect of the big fish little pond effect, but they're clearly negative. Okay, so there's 41 different countries, so I'm looking at a caterpillar plot that shows country-to-country variation across the 40 countries. Okay, so the residual school year in school effects for all the predicted values are negative. These caterpillar plots are the predicted value plus and minus a confidence interval, and so all the effects are negative, although there's a few of the confidence intervals that overlap with the zero effect. For the big fish little pond effect, similarly, all the effects are significantly negative. So there's pretty good generalizability of these negative effects. Okay, now here I'm asking how the negative effects are related to whether students begin school early or late, repeat a year, or accelerated. The negative year in school effect is almost unaffected by the inclusion of starting age, repeating a year in school, or acceleration. Although some of these variables considered separately have small effects on math self-concept that are consistent with the year in school effect. That is, for example, the positive effects of starting school later, age, or repeating a year in school. These effects are mostly explained by the inclusion of year in school as a predictor variable. The inclusion of none of these variables had much effect on the big fish little pond effect. The big fish little pond effect is quite separate from the year in school effect. Although both of them are based upon the same logic, they're essentially unrelated to each other. Consistent with the underlying premise, year in school effects is the critical variable rather than starting age, acceleration, or retention. So that's a real critical conclusion. Okay, now how are the effects related to or moderated by achievement, gender, age, immigrant status, home language, and socioeconomic status? These analyses demonstrate that both the residual school year in school effect and the big fish little pond effect generalize very well over the student characteristics that are considered here. Although some of these variables interacted with either year in school or big fish little pond effect, the sizes of these interactions were consistently small and much smaller than the negative effects of year in school and the negative effects of school average ability. In summary, the negative year in school effects and big fish little pond effects generalize well over students differing in age, achievement levels, gender, home language, immigrant status, and socioeconomic status. To what extent do the big fish little pond and year in school effects generalize to other variables? So here I'm looking at anxiety, math anxiety, interest, enjoyment, instrumental motivation, different learning strategies, memorization, elaboration, control, and orientation, competitive, cooperative. The negative big fish little pond effect in support of previous research and negative year in school effects, which hasn't been looked at previously, are both systematically smaller for these other variables than they were for math self-concept. However, there were no big fish little pond effects or no year in school effects that were significantly positive or favorable for any of these outcomes. The year in school effects were significantly negative, unfavorable for anxiety, interest, enjoyment, instrumental motivation, memorization, elaboration, and competitive orientation. The present investigation demonstrates the negative effects of de facto year in school on math self-concept. Theoretically, these findings have a strong theoretical rationale based on the frame of reference effects that underpin the big fish little pond effect. Empirically, the results are extremely robust and have broad generalizability. The focus of the study is on mass self-concept, but the negative year in school effects generalize to a range of other psychosocial variables as well. The highly robust negative year in school effects on a range of psychosocial variables have important implications for school systems around the world. The results have implications for theoretical models of social comparison process and frame of reference effects, but also policy implications. The present investigation has extended theory by showing the two very different frame of reference effects to be evident in numerous culturally diverse countries and to be consistent across ability levels, thus earning their consideration possibly as pan-human theoretical models. As regard educational policy, in many countries around the world, high-ability students are increasingly taught in academically selective schools, but these results suggest that this may not be the optimal environment for high-ability students, certainly not in terms of self-concept. Similarly, educational policymakers in different countries use diverse strategies in relation to school starting age, repeating grades, and acceleration, apparently without fully understanding the implications of these policy practices in relation to academic self-concept, motivation, and a range of affective variables with potentially long-term implications for academic choice and accomplishment. Thank you. Okay, now the history of this research is kind of interesting because I just kind of happened onto it almost by chance because of the funny way the PISA database is constructed. So the PISA database has this year in school, so that although everybody is 15 in theory that's included in the PISA database, they can be in quite a different set of years in school. And for the most part, educational researchers think of this as a nuisance that have to be dealt with, and so usually you control for that year in school effect one way or another, a whole variety of ways. But when one of the studies that I was doing where we looked at that, I realized that, wait a minute, there is a systematic effect of year in school, and it's a funny one. And so we looked at that, and then that finding just sort of went on to the back burner for a number of years. And so, you know, a year or two ago, I decided to go ahead and pursue that. Yeah.
What is the percentage of those kids who are in different years, even though they're 15 years of age?
Varies all over the place from country to country. But I think it's roughly a quarter of the students are outside of their normal year group. So there's lots, but in some countries it's none, or almost none, and in some countries it's more. I should get that. Yeah. I should look at that.
How are you defining retention? How are you defining retention?
Well, I look at it two different ways. One, de facto retention just says that you're at a different age. You're behind what you would normally be given your age. And so that could be either because of starting age, or it could be because you were held back. But I do have information on being held back. And so I also look at retention in a more narrow sense of whether or not you've ever repeated a grade, or how many grades you've repeated.
Because the research on repeating says that it's extremely negative, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. No, it says that repeating a grade is positive.
This says repeating a grade is positive, yes. But there's a lot of research that says
and there's a lot of bad research. There's a lot of bad research. Yeah. But this is a really critical aspect.
Yes, it is.
Not only this, but what you have in mind might be related to achievement rather than self-concept.
Yes, absolutely. So a kid is not traditional.
Okay, in the paper is available because it's online now. I show that the research showing the negative effects of repeating a grade on achievement is mostly pretty dubious. And there's certainly some systematic reviews that are saying that the effects are negligible. And there's some real complications in how you do that. And the problem, part of the problem is that it's a real difficult research design to come up with. But I'll go into that one a little bit later because I've got some commentaries that, obviously that's the most surprising finding.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see. I'm wondering whether you could use Tim's as a counterpart and look at relative age in grade for the early waves of the LSA data. So look at it from the alternative perspective. So you've got grade in a year, which you do, because then you should find the same.
Okay, let me go ahead, and I got a couple of other slides here.
Before you go, I'm going to ask one more question about the definition of relative year in school.
Yeah.
Is that a mean, or is that from the mode? Because say if you've got...
I'm not sure, I can't remember whether, it's not the mode, but it might be the median.
Okay.
It's definitely not the mode. It's either the mean or the median. I don't remember which offhand.
Because if it was the mean, if you had 75% that were in year 9 and 25% that were in year 10, then 75% would have a negative relative year in school. I don't think that's the definition you want, right?
Yeah, I'll have to go back and have a look at that one. Yeah.
Before you go back, go forward, can you go back and then oh no, this is enough. Some of the things that you were talking about included the achievement and moderating effects on achievement.
Yeah.
So you don't have it in there. In that slide there, I cannot see it. I might be just open, cannot see it.
No, that's...
What happens? The effects of it.
No, let's see. Yeah, here.
Oh, okay.
Achievement doesn't moderate the effects to any extent. And that's a particularly interesting one with the big fish little pond effect. It says that being the brightest kid in a selective school, the negative effects of school average achievement are similar in size to what being at the bottom of your class. So everybody suffers the big fish little pond effect. But it's not, Okay, let me go ahead and, okay, so, all right, I'll just let you read those. These are some of my good friends who are skeptics of the findings, and then we'll go back and look at that, because I mean, obviously, that's an issue that we brought up here as well. So, to an extent, they're both arguing that the data that I have is very strong in relation to year in school. None of them are neither of them are particularly upset about the issue of acceleration, but both of them are saying that I'm unjustified in talking about retention, which is more or less the same issue that you were raising. Okay, so what I'm arguing is that the overall effect of relative year in school is clearly negative. That much there's no question about. This variable included redshirting. Redshirting's the expression, the American sporting expression, where you hold somebody out so they have an extra year of eligibility for their university football team or something like that. So that's a common practice, and it's becoming actually very common that parents hold their kids back so they're the oldest in the class rather than the youngest. And
all of us are reminded of Abbott, Tony Abbott and Putin, certain Putin.
Okay, so what I argued was that when I included these measures, when I included variables representing these measures in the model, they didn't have much effect on relative year in school. Okay, so the critical variable, the critical model that they were talking about, I don't know whether you can see this or not. All right, so I included each of these in the model and showed that the relative year in school effect was relatively unaffected by the inclusion of these variables in the model. So what I'm arguing, and maybe on shaky ground, but I don't think so. What I'm arguing is that relative year in school explains everything that can be explained by acceleration, starting age, and repeating. And therefore, it's a much theoretically more unifying variable to consider, and that there's essentially nothing in retention, for example, that it explains above and beyond relative year in school. Now, if you look at model 4A, the effect of retention on academic self-concept is positive. It's not very large, but it's clearly significantly positive. And when you include it in the full model with relative year in school, it becomes even smaller, but negative. So I guess what that says is that there's some residual effect after you control for relative year in school. But from my perspective, I think that I'm safe in arguing that although the effect of retention is small, it's clearly positive and fully explained by relative year in school. And so that's the critical bit in relation to that. I guess I'm not sure whether I want the study to hang on that one finding, but it's obviously one of the findings that's going to be, it's one of the conclusions that I'm drawing that will be most controversial. And certainly John Hattie, whose meta-analysis shows retention is one of the worst things you can do, but mostly looking at achievement and mostly looking at bad research. The better research suggests that there's almost no effect of retention. Now, one of the things that I've got in mind is a next step that Phil and I have started talking about, and he was sort of alluding to earlier, is to look at the effect of retention from a longitudinal perspective, using the ELSE data. And what I'm interested in is what long-term implications can be predicted by the effect of retention. Now, the problem with this is that it's really hard to get a reasonable design to look at this, and any design that you have is going to be biased, so that any outcome variable that's related to achievement, you know the kids that have been retained have a lower achievement. Now, there's no way that you can put in enough control variables to control for that, because the control variables will never control for all of that. There will always be some residual pre-existing difference, and almost for sure that will be negative. Now, that doesn't affect the self-concept findings, because if there is that bias, the effect would be even more positive. But the problem is that if you look at it in terms of looking at achievement, there will be residual effects associated, uncontrolled pre-existing differences related to being held back, that you won't be able to account for. But it'll still be an interesting one to look at. So you want to go ahead and you had a question sort of related to that.
The only thing I was thinking about is, so the first two cohorts of the LSA are representative samples of Year 9 students, irrespective of age, and the subsequent cohorts are 15-year-olds, irrespective of grade. And so I was just thinking, can you use those as counterpoints?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, the problem is that the outcome variables are so different.
In what? The outcome variables? Oh, in terms of self-concept.
Yeah, or in terms of almost anything. I mean, the only ones that are consistent are achievements.
The early two waves have self-concept in all three domains, and it's the STQ. So you would have the same self-concept measure.
Let's see, what was I starting to say? Now, when you're looking at achievement, what most studies do is they look at a person who has been held back, and then they compare them with the people that weren't held back on a subsequent achievement test. The subsequent achievement test is based upon what these kids learned in the following year because they weren't held back. So if you hold back somebody in Year 8 and everybody else goes on to Year 9, and then you test everybody on the basis of material that was given in Year 9, it's hardly surprising that the Year 8 person doesn't do.
Is that what really happens?
Huh?
Is that what really happens in reality? You have the kids in Year 9 and those kids in Year 8, and then you give them the same test and compare. It's hard to believe. Why don't you move them to Year 9 and then give them the test after Year 9? I mean, is that sure. That would be, or compare them with Year 8 students. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Comparing them with Year 8 students is done not a lot, but certainly there's a sizable number of studies there, and the effects go way down. So the big negative effects are when you compare them with Year 9 students on tests that cover Year 9 content.
That's silly.
Yeah.
It depends what you're focusing on.
And if you do a meta-analysis, lo and behold, those studies dominate. So there was one propensity matching study that was done that is a much stronger way of controlling, and that showed no effects.
Felix as well?
Huh?
Was that Felix as well, in Texas?
Might have been. I'm not sure. I can't remember. I don't think so, because I probably would remember if that was his. But yeah, it's cited in the article. So yeah, I better more carefully read the article before I do the presentation, so I can be a little more on top of answering these questions. It took a long time for it to get published. Okay. Any other questions or any other thoughts? Surprising findings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll get cited a lot. And so I can look at, we can explore strategies for the retreat next week. I've been given the task of looking at strategies of how to get things cited more. And this is an interesting paper to do. Because first of all,
start with your policy implications. Then you'd it'd really help people in. Start with the big picture. This is where we're at, and then this is what I found.
I have a general question. As you know, I haven't been following this literature all that much. I remember your first paper on Big Fish, Little Pond Effect. I really liked it. And I know that you had some discussions with educationists about selective schools and things like that. How come to this day we do have selective schools? It has not left any impact on the policymakers in terms of getting rid of them, or what is the explanation for that?
It's a really interesting one. The New South Wales government did a big study on the effects of selective schools long before I was doing Big Fish, Little Pond Effect, and came up with the conclusion that there was no benefits. And so they...
what were the outcomes?
Achievement.
In terms of...
Achievement.
Achievement within high school. Has anyone looked at beyond high school?
Okay, sure, I have.
Okay.
But this was focusing just on achievement, just on HSC kinds of results, and concluded that there was no evidence of any benefits, although they suggested that there might be benefits on psychosocial variables, but they hadn't looked at any of those. And so there's a suggestion very early on in the stage, back in the time when there was only 10 or 11 selective schools and no quasi-selective schools, that they do away with it. And there's such a hue and cry from the parents that they didn't do that. And then it must have been maybe 15 years ago, Tony Vinson did a big study on selective schools and came up with they're using a lot of the stuff that I had done, but other things as well, came up with the conclusions that they should be gotten rid of, or so on and so forth. And they're so popular that the government wasn't going to look at that at all. And so no government is going to go back on that because they're so popular. And then the third part of that that's an interesting one was that, most of you have heard this story, but that's all right. Early in my career, I didn't know that when you're talking to a journalist, even over the phone, that you have to say off the record for them not to be. And so I got into this, I was being interviewed regularly for when they have the selective school exams. They would call me up and say, okay, let's have a counter perspective and so forth. And so we were talking about that. And then from my perspective, the interview was over, and I made some throwaway comment that if you want to look at the positive effects of selective schools on self-concept, you should be measuring the parents, not the kids. And that was the headline. But fortunately, I think that it was quite accurate. It was a throwaway. It was sort of and I didn't actually have any evidence of it, but I suspected that would be the case.
So, Malcolm Gladwell picked up on it in his book, the Underdog, whatever it's called.
Yeah, and I was quite surprised. I got an email from. I got an email when it first came out from. In fact, it was from John Hattie, and he said, "Herb, you're famous. You're now in the airport bestseller." And so I went and looked at the book. I thought, where did he get? And then I realized that maybe 10 years before that book, he interviewed me for over an hour on the phone, and he wrote an article based on that for the New York Times. And so that was that. And it's interesting, about half the time that I cite that in an academic article, I've been asked to take it out.
So what you're saying is that science doesn't matter as far as policymakers are concerned.
Especially not in education.
I think it's not about policymakers. It's about, the general public. The whole world in inclusive education is going in that direction of inclusion. And, aren't these gifted people or high achievers gifted enough, special enough to be in that inclusive formula? Mm. I mean, people with special needs are put into mainstream classrooms. Mm. And there are all kinds of ways that the teachers have to adapt to the different needs of the different people, of the different students. And yet these gifted students are not taken care of in this inclusive formula. So this is surprising. It's not about the policymakers, I think. It's that they have no choice. People want it.
There's a really interesting study by Kate Generalisability. You know Kate, and she was showing that between school tracking is disappearing, but at the same time within school tracking is exploding, and so that the overall balance of ability stratification has stayed pretty much constant. And I've never got around to writing it up, but the correlation between achievement ICCs and average achievement of a country is negative. So the more stratified you are, the lower the average achievement. And if you look at Australia across all the PISA waves, Australia's become more stratified. Australia's become more stratified at the same time as their decline in the PISA rankings has, dropped through the floor.
Has anyone looked at what these kids actually lose? So the big assumption about going to selective school is that they would gain a lot.
With the high school and beyond database, I had data 2 and 4 years after graduation from high school, and I had 20-some outcome variables that included subsequent achievement, going to university, all sorts of things, and the effect of school average achievement was negative on every one.
So this is actually academic performance, but there are other indicators.
But no, it was also occupational aspirations and educational aspirations and stuff like that too. So it was
pretty damning evidence.
Yeah.
I believe that. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
I went to selective school.
Yeah.
That explains a lot.
One of the interesting things that Phil is looking at that's sort of a different perspective on this is he's looking at the long-term effects of going to an elite private school. And that has positive socioeconomic effects. And the elite private schools aren't necessarily academically, most of them aren't academically selective, but they're selective on something that's correlated with that. And so it'd be interesting. And so the few times that I've tried to, mostly it's almost impossible to separate out the effects of school average achievement and school average socioeconomic status, because in most cases they're so highly correlated that if you try and separate them, it just doesn't work that well, because the correlation is over 0.9, so it's controlling from one, there's not much. But to the extent that there is a differential effect, probably the effect, what I found, at least in the times where I was able to separate them to any extent at all, was that the school average socioeconomic status had a positive influence and school average achievement had the negative influence. And so clearly the big fish little pond effect is specific to school average achievement, but in justification for some of the parents who want their kids to go to selective schools, there's probably some long-term economic benefits. In the study that the research that you were looking at, did you try to separate out with school average socioeconomic status your a key variable of selectivity?
Yeah, so there's extension of that primary and secondary effect model of Bowden, and the addition was that the first model was removing selection effects. So it was the effect of private schools was positive on wages, age 35, controlling for selection effects.
It's depressing. For a different reason.
Yeah. There's another.
So the kind of dubious implication of that is that if you want to maximize benefits for your kids, you send them to an elite private school that's got lots of dumb students.